Welcome to today's Sheep Connect New South Wales webinar, Sheep Blowfly Resistance Update, and our presenter today will be Deb Maxwell. My name is Fiona MacArthur and I'm a coordinator for Sheep Connect New South Wales. Sheep Connect New South Wales is your AWI funded extension network. We aim to deliver key information which is relevant, timely and credible via various methods of delivery. Our key delivery staff are Megan Rogers, who is our project manager, and myself, a coordinator based out of the New England. We are changing to keep you up to date. Join our network. It's free to join at www.sheepconnectnewsouthwales.com.au. You can also join our social media discussion at Sheep Connect New South Wales on both Facebook and Twitter. Our webinars continue to be our main delivery platform at this time, and we are still rolling out weekly webinars for you. If you'd like to access any of our past webinar recordings, it's simple. You can just go to our website and register and download them. In addition, on our events page on our Sheep Connect New South Wales website, you will find all our up and coming webinars, and you can also keep in touch with us on social media as they will be advertised regularly on there. Also, if you haven't done so already, join our Sheep Connect New South Wales podcast. It's time for you. You can join our podcast on Spotify or iTunes. Just simply search Sheep Connect New South Wales. And new to Sheep Connect New South Wales is our Sheep Live Q&A sessions. I will give you more information about our upcoming Sheep Connect Q&A session later today. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. Our post-webinar survey will be emailed out to you this afternoon. I thank you in advance for filling it in. We really value your feedback. This webinar is being recorded and the recording can be accessed via our website. Also, a link to the recording will be emailed to you this afternoon. All attendees are in listen-only mode. If you can't see this control panel in full on your screen, simply click the red arrow and it will expand. From here, handouts are available. So the first two handouts that I have for you to download today have been provided by Deb, and the first one is a fly in the ointment, managing chemical resistance in blowflies. And the second handout is resistance management strategy for the Australian sheep blowfly. So you can download them now and throughout the presentation. Asking questions of our presenter is easy. Simply type your questions into the question pane. And Megan Rogers is in the background today, and she is our project manager and will be collating all your questions and chairing our question time after the presentation. So keep them coming throughout the presentation for Megan. Thank you. Now going to launch the first of today's poll questions. The first poll question is, what is your industry role? Producer, advisor, non-government, advisor, government, education, or other? As a webinar organizer, the poll questions give me feedback that you are able to hear me and engage with the platform. And it's also helpful for our presenter so she can know what the audience's level is when they're signing in. Most of the votes are nearly in. I encourage everyone to participate. The information is very valuable for us. And I'll close that poll off in 3, 2, 1. And I'll share the results with you on screen now. 33% producers, 31% advisors non-government, 9% advisors government, 9% education, and 19% from an other source. The second question we have today is from Deb, and it's for the producers only. Do you feel like your chemical Flystrike preventative treatment is not lasting as long as the label claims? And I'll launch that for you now. Your options are yes, no, and unsure. And this is a producer only question. The polls are anonymous, so no one knows who's voting what. The votes are still coming in, so I'll leave it open just for a little bit longer. And closing the poll in 3, 2, 1, and I'll share the results with you now on screen. 30% yes, 24% no, and 45% unsure. Our next poll question again is for producers only. Are you still mulesing any of your lambs? And launching that now. And I'll close that poll off in 3, 2, 1. And I'll share the results on screen with you all now. 34% yes to mulesing, 66% no. And the final poll question again is for producers only. Do you know what your mob's breech strike scores are? And launching that now, yes, no, or do not understand this terminology. Votes are still coming in. Thanks everyone for participating in the polls today, much appreciated. Closing this poll off in 3, 2, 1. And I'll share the results on screen for you now. Yes, 44%, 37% no, and 19% do not understand this terminology. Thanks for participating in the polls, everybody. It's now ready to start today's Sheep Connect New South Wales webinar, and I'm pleased to invite to the platform Deb Maxwell. I'll just get Deb to share her webcam, unmute herself, and while I'll introduce her more formally. Deb has been in the sheep extension for the last 28 years with the Queensland DPI and the Sheep CRC. She has been the technical manager and now the executive officer of Paraboss since Wormfly and FlyBoss was moved under the banner of Paraboss back in 2014. Deb also runs her own superfine merino stud near Guyra, where she employs the Paraboss recommendations against the high regional challenges of worms and flies. So Deb, I'll now share your screen with the audience. And we will be ready to begin today's presentation. Thanks, Deb. You should be unmuted now, Deb.
Yes, thank you very much. So thanks, Fiona. I think it was really quite interesting to see some of those results from the polls, and we'll be talking about some of those things today. Now, for those who aren't familiar with Paraboss, it's Australia's premier management information resource for sheep and goat producers through WormBoss, FlyBoss and FlyBoss. And information for cattle is currently under development, and it'll cover worms, lice, buffalo fly and ticks. FlyBoss is what we're going to concentrate on today. It was developed about 10 years ago in the Sheep CRC, and after the CRC, it was grouped with its sister sites, WormBoss and FlyBoss, and it's now managed under the Paraboss project. And that's funded by AWI, MLA and the University of New England, and UNE manages the program. Now, FlyBoss provides you with a wealth of information on flies and fly strike management, and so you'll just find it at flyboss.com.au. This presentation is about fly strike control, but it's about control that should work not just today, but also in years to come. And that means the strategies that I'll outline will be about preventing fly strike whilst also minimising the development of fly strike resistant chemicals. Flies resistant to chemicals, sorry. Now, most of the information I'll present is in those reference documents that Fiona has already outlined, how you can find them on the platform here today, but if you can't find them there or you're looking for them later on, you can find them on the FlyBoss website. You just go to flyboss.com.au, and right on the homepage there you'll see an image, that I've got shown on the screen here, about chemical resistant blowflies. And if you click on that, it'll take you straight to the page with the 2 documents. And if that link gets changed in the future, simply Google FlyBoss resistance strategies. Now, during this presentation, I'll also be naming some product names. That doesn't mean Paraboss particularly recommends any specific products. It's just to make it easier for the producers to identify with the chemical names. And generally, I'll use the names for the first product that was released with that chemical active, because that's what most producers will be familiar with. But remember, there are plenty of different brands of the same chemicals, and the information applies equally to them. Now, we've had a history of absolutely excellent chemicals for flystrike control, but we can't expect new products every few years. The most recent chemical for flystrike control is imidacloprid. That's in Avenge plus Fly. It's been around to treat lice for a while, but a fly claim has only come a few years ago. Dicyclonol, which was released as Click, and spinosad, which was released as extinosad, they're about 20 years old. Cyromazine, which was Vetrazin, it's over 40 years old. And the synthetic pyrethroids and ivermectin are also quite old. Diazinon, it's one of the organophosphates. It was developed in about the 50s, and it replaced organochlorine chemicals like DDT. But resistance to it was already widespread decades ago. So again, new chemicals don't appear very often, and we do know that resistance is appearing to various extents with current chemicals. So if producers want to keep those chemicals working for as long as possible each application and for years to come, and as I say, we've got various chemical company reps and resellers on here. If you want to be selling these products for many more years too, we've got to make sure that we include strategies that minimize the development of resistance. And you know, flies only travel a few kilometers, so any resistant flies, certainly on the moderate to large size properties, they're likely to have developed because of the practices on that property. And of course, it's not just the sheep industry that has to deal with resistance, but for the sheep industry, flystrike is a major threat due to the animal welfare concerns and the time and cost in bringing a new active chemical to the market. So an IPM approach is recommended. An IPM is simply integrated parasite management, and that P you might have heard of in other industries. It can also stand for pest, so that's when referring to insects in crops or to feral animals. It just means that instead of relying on one thing for control, you use a number of methods or strategies together. Now, FlyBoss doesn't have a set program for flystrike control. Rather, it's a set of strategies and principles, and you bring those together to suit your situation. And we'll cover those now. Now, if you do understand resistance, you'll have a better chance of minimizing its development. And there are 2 types of resistance in regard to flystrike. One is that of the flies becoming resistant to the chemicals we try to kill them with, and that's not good. And the other is that the sheep themselves can be resistant to flystrike, and that is a good thing. Now, our concern mainly in this presentation is about flies becoming resistant to the chemicals. It just means some don't die from the treatment that would have killed them some years ago. It's also important to realise that resistance isn't a yes-no thing. A fly might not be killed by one treatment, but it could be killed by another. And also, they might not be killed by the standard concentration that we put on them, but they may die when it's at a higher concentration. Now, unfortunately, there's no commercial test to see if you have resistant flies. There is a research test, but it's quite expensive. And then the laboratory data that we get from that can be quite hard to translate into what will really happen on your farm and in the paddock, because there are many other factors that are involved in how the product actually performs, such as the wool, environmental factors, and what the real fly pressure is at any particular time. So you can apply an IPM approach by firstly reducing your reliance on chemicals, and secondly by using those chemicals wisely. So now we'll look at ways to use less chemicals. You can reduce chemical use in two broad ways. Firstly, you can make sheep less susceptible to strike, so they don't require treating. And secondly, you can reduce the exposure of the sheep to the flies. So first up's reducing susceptibility. Now, you're all familiar with these. And as I mentioned before, there is the other resistance. It's that of the sheep being resistant to or not susceptible to flies. That's the first one. For years, we've also modified breeches with the mules operation, and we've docked tails. Scouring is also a big contributor to strike, so minimising that is useful. And of course, shearing and crutching make a sheep less susceptible to strike. So a bit more detail on these. With breeding, concentrate on lowering fleece rot if you want to make your sheep less susceptible to body strike. And the key factors for breech strike you can breed for, they're breech wrinkle and dag. They're the most important. And then breech cover. You can select your ewes and rams visually on these traits, and really should do so. And you can also use Australian sheep breeding values to select rams for breech wrinkle and dag and cover and fleece rot if your stud provides those figures. And if they don't, maybe it's time you ask them to do so. Now, we all know that mulesing is highly effective, but we also know it's increasingly unacceptable to the buyers of our sheep and wool. So breeding for breech strike resistance should be a big priority. But in the meantime, if you're still mulesing, use pain relief products. And if landmarking is coming up, use that as an opportunity to objectively assess just how susceptible your sheep really are. And it was actually quite good to see those poll results that quite a lot of people already do know what the scores are for their sheep. So you can score the breech wrinkle and the cover just of a sample of, say, 50 lambs, and just figure out then what your average wrinkle and cover score is. Once you actually know those scores, you can actually put them into our new FlyBoss tool. That's the Flystrike risk simulator. And you can use that to assess your strike risk, and you can check out whether or not the sheep, what they would be like if they were mulesed or if they were not mulesed. And I'll tell you more about that tool shortly in the presentation. Docking, tail length to the tip of the vulva or the third palpable joint. We've known about that for eons. However, I was actually surprised to see a graph the other day, this one that I've got here for you. And I didn't know that full story until I saw that. The research actually found that even longer tails below the vulva or at the fourth joint resulted in an even lower strike risk. So just have a look at this graph. I'll just move something for a moment. Just have a look at the graph here. And you'll see, if I can get my mouse to move on here. No, I can't. So we'll skip that. Have a look at the graph. Up the left-hand side of it there, you'll see that we've got the number of strikes per 100 sheep. And in this trial, the group with the lowest rate of strike, that's the green box, it's got about 12 struck sheep in 100. It's actually the longer tails. And the medium tails, they're the ones to the tip of the vulva. They were nearer to 30 struck sheep out of 100. And the short tails were closer to 40. Now, of course, tails also bring other problems, a higher risk of rectal prolapses and arthritis and skin cancer risk to them as well. So I encourage you to make the change to longer tails at your next land marking if you've still got them a little bit too short. Now, scouring is another major cause of breech strike, especially in the southern half of Australia. And again, you can select visually and with ASBVs against DAG. Just note that if you are already or planning to select for worm resistance, it actually has very little impact on reducing DAG. So DAG does need to be selected for separately. You may also need to crutch to remove DAG, and that's also going to be good for removing urine stain, which is another predisposing factor to breech strike. And just keep your worms under good control and be aware that some plants, particularly grazing oats, can increase the amount of DAG. Now, shearing and crutching time does have a major impact on fly strike risk. I understand, of course, that there's plenty of other factors on your farm that are going to dictate when you actually shear and crutch, but nevertheless, sometimes you might be able to tweak your shearing and crutching times to get better fly strike control. You can again use the FlyBoss Flystrike tools that we've got to assess how a change in shearing or crutching affects your strike risk. And note that the lowest strike risk, of course, is going to be immediately after you shear, and then it's going to increase progressively. But at some point, it does actually plateau out a bit. So it's not just higher and higher until the next shearing. Now, we can also reduce the exposure of the sheep to the flies. You can keep sheep away from where there are more flies. But what about fly trapping? That's an important question. We do get asked that quite a bit. So first of all, flies don't all hang around in the same place. Even though they can travel a few kilometres or so, they do actually prefer areas that have got water and shade and long grass that improves the humidity. So you might keep your more susceptible sheep out of those locations when there's a particularly high fly strike risk, such as after heavy rain. Fly traps, well, they did hold quite a lot of promise originally. I was actually involved in some of the original fly trapping work with Queensland DPI, and they are certainly capable of catching a lot of flies. But unfortunately, they weren't particularly successful at reducing fly strike rates because it really takes very few flies to strike susceptible sheep. And that smell of fleece rot or urine stain or DAG is just going to draw the flies in from quite a distance, you know, from up to a couple of kilometres away. So what do you do with traps? They can be useful for monitoring a rise in flies, but don't use them indiscriminately, because if you use them in the likes of open drums with bait, poison bait in them, you'll actually be killing the secondary flies as well. And those secondary blowflies actually prey on the Lucilia caprina that cause or instigate most of the strikes. Right, so now we get on to chemical use. I'm going to take you through a number of slides here to outline how the concentration of chemical applied to a sheep changes and the implications for development of resistance to the chemicals by the flies. Now, I'll start with this graph and gradually I'll add more complexity to it. Now, on the left-hand side, you can see there that we've got the concentration of chemical on the sheep. We've got low at the bottom, high at the top. Now, when a new product is being developed, it gets tested with a lot of flies, and they find that there's a certain concentration of that chemical that's required to kill all maggots, and that's our red line there. At that stage in the development of the chemical, nothing is known about whether these particular maggots carry genes for chemical resistance. In fact, the genetics of resistance are really not very well known now. And we can't, for instance, DNA test a fly to see if it's going to be resistant to chemicals. So the development work establishes that all maggots that they were trialling this with died at that particular concentration. Now, when the chemical is applied to a sheep, it doesn't just stay there forever. Over time, it's going to degrade, and sunlight and rain particularly do their part. So at the bottom of this graph, we've got time. And at the far left, you can see we've got the application time when that chemical was applied to the sheep. And then it progresses to the right. That's the weeks after application. And you'll see that the concentration of chemical, you see that sloping line, concentration of the chemical on the sheep gradually declines over time. So putting our two previous slides together, now you can see that if we want to have a concentration high enough to kill all the maggots for a period of some weeks, not just what's happening today, then it needs to be applied at a higher rate initially. And this is going to allow a protective level of chemical to stay on the wool for some weeks before it eventually degrades to lower levels down below that red line where it isn't killing all of the maggots. And that period between when the chemical is applied to when some maggots are not killed by the treatment is called the protection period. And all the commercial chemicals operate in a fairly similar way. Some decline faster than others. And of course, you'll get a couple of weeks from some products and you'll get months from others, just depending on the particular chemical and its formulation. Okay, so in this next slide, you can see that there's a point where there's enough concentration to kill all of the maggots, but as it drops down further, some of them will still die, but others will actually survive. And then eventually the concentration gets low enough that all maggots survive. It kills no maggots at that level below the blue line. So anywhere before the red line, all of them are dying. Between that red line and the blue line, some of them are dying, and below the blue line, all of them are going to live. Now, that period where some maggots die and some survive is called the tail. And the length of time of that tail, it could be days to weeks. It really depends on various factors and the particular chemicals and so forth. What happens is resistance to chemicals builds in a population when the flies that carry genes for resistance have an advantage over the susceptible flies, the ones that don't carry the genes for resistance. And these susceptible flies still die during that tail period, but the flies with the partial resistance, they manage to live and they can then reproduce. Now, their numbers are going to be able to build up as a result of that in over and above the susceptible ones. So again, when the concentration was higher, that is above the red line, neither the susceptible or the partially resistant flies have any advantage over each other. Resistance isn't building at that point. When the concentration is below the blue line, they all live. Again, neither have an advantage over the other. So it's during that tail period where some live, those with resistance genes, and some die, that that there's opportunity for resistance to build up if there's flies there that are living. Okay, now, while the genetics of the resistance are still not known, It's likely that it's due to a number of genes in the flies, and that the more genes for resistance any particular fly has, the higher concentration of chemical it's going to be able to survive. On that assumption, the flies that were partially resistant and survived during the tail period, they're going to breed with other flies, and some of those will be susceptible flies, some of them will be other partially resistant flies. And so what will happen is eventually more flies appear that have more genes for resistance, and they will be able to survive at a higher concentration than originally killed all maggots. And you can see that by my green line there, that we've taken the concentration up a little bit higher to kill those particular resistant ones. And as a result, of course, too, you see that the protection period actually shortens in as well. Now, more flies with more resistance genes survive and breed, then more of their offspring are going to have more resistance genes and are going to tolerate yet higher concentrations of chemical. And again, the protection period is shortening. And while ever the flies are exposed to the chemical, the potential is there for them to become more and more resistant. So this outlines why it is important to think about the chemical tail and to consider what you can do to minimize the selection for resistant flies during that period. And aside from just using chemicals less, there certainly are some things that you can do. Okay, so one way is to simply remove the chemical. And you do that by shearing or crutching. And of course, you want to get the most out of your product. So if you aim to remove it through a shearing or crutching process just before that tail period, then it's gone. But just make sure that you also adhere to the wool harvesting intervals so that you don't shear or crutch too soon after application. Another way is to have no fly challenge during the tail period. And therefore, it doesn't matter that there's a low concentration of chemical. There's no flies there to be selected. And you can do that by choosing a chemical that has a protection period that extends well beyond the Flystrike risk period, typically into cold or dry weather. And the third way is to simply override the tail period with another chemical. And in theory, it could be the same product, but ideally, this is where you would apply a different chemical group to what has just been used before. And so this leads us into an essential piece of knowledge if you're to effectively minimize the development of resistance, and that's to know about the chemical groups. They work in different ways, so resistance to one doesn't necessarily mean resistance to another, but there is cross resistance within a group. And it's important to realize that cyromazine, that's vetrazine or similar products, and dicyclonol, that's click or similar products, are in the same group, the same chemical group. And that means that if resistance has developed to one of them, then the other has a larger chance of losing some of its effectiveness as well. Now, here are the 6 groups currently available for fly control and some example products, but be aware that there's plenty of generic brands of some of these chemicals. So you really do need to look at labels and know what the chemical active and group is in the product that you intend to use. The other trap for young players is that dicyclonol comes in 3 strengths, a bit like beer. Clixin, Click and Click Extra are all dicyclonol, but with different concentrations and therefore different protection periods. Some people actually have been known to think Clixin is just a much cheaper generic brand of Click, and they've bought it because it's cheaper. and they've gone and applied it to their merinos, expecting 5 or 6 months of protection, and then suddenly find sheep getting struck after 3 months. And that's because it's formulated with a lower concentration for shorter protection periods on the likes of lambs that are intended for slaughter. So the lesson is, read the label. Now, once you know the chemical group, you should ideally rotate their use. Now, on a practical level, that means don't use the same group when you're treating struck sheep compared to what was applied as a preventative. And if you do need to use 2 preventatives in one season, ideally use 2 groups. And don't forget lice treatments either. Imidacloprid, spinosyn and ivermectin affect both lice and flies. And so if you just apply one of these for lice, remember that any flies that happen to be exposed to it also have the chance of being selected for resistance. So where possible, eradicate lice and stop using routine lice treatments. Now, when you do choose a chemical, pick 1 or 2 in a row if you need to give protection past your Flystrike risk time. Now, just regarding the effectiveness and getting the most from your preventative treatment, you can actually predict the time to apply it when it will give you the biggest reduction in Flystrike risk. Now, FlyBoss has got a new tool called the Flystrike Risk Simulator, and it lets you make selections for your situation, and then you press a button and it optimizes the time of chemical application. We've already got some online tools that do this, but the new tool has quite a bit more. And I just want to, at this point, acknowledge Brian Horton from the University of Tasmania. And Brian's developed all of these excellent tools for FlyBoss and LiceBoss. Now, the new tool with all its extra features and large graphs and so forth is only available as a downloadable tool, but it does work on both Windows and Mac computers. So you also download a Flystrike risk file for a location, and that will be within 5 kilometres of you. So it's really quite specific to your property. Then you choose your mulesing status, you choose your times for shearing, for crutching, for chemical treatments, and you choose the type of chemical that you want to apply. And what's really great with this tool is that you can also customize your sheep a lot more than with the previous tools that we have. Firstly, what you do is you choose a particular class of sheep, such as ewes or lambs, and then you can stipulate how Flystrike resistant your sheep are by selecting the mob average scores you think that they have for fleece rot, breech wrinkle, dag, and breech cover. You can see the picture that I have there on the screen. That's one of the a screenshot from the tool, and all you will need to do is simply take your mouse over to where you think your sheep is on that scale and click it, and it automatically enters the scores. So it's done quite easily. Now, if you want to find that Flystrike risk simulator, you can just go onto the FlyBoss homepage, and there on the right you've got the little image that we've got on the homepage at the moment. You click on that and it'll take you to the page where you do all the downloading from. Or you can look in the FlyBoss tools menu as shown in the diagram down there at the bottom, go to the tools and then go over there to the Flystrike risk simulator downloadable. If you want to look at some really quickly, but they don't have quite as many features, you'll see also in that image there, it's got Flystrike quick tools online, so you can give them a go too if you haven't done so already. Now, of course, I still need to remind you to read the product label and follow the instructions if you expect to get the best possible results. But I also want to emphasise that most product labels will state up to in relation to the expected protection period. And that's because there's a variety of factors that will affect that period. such as the wool type and the length, level of sunlight exposure, and particularly the amount and intensity of rainfall on the sheep. But of course, how well you apply the chemical is actually going to have a really significant effect. And a lot of the investigations into suspected resistance find that the reduced protection period has often come because of something about how it's been applied to the sheep or some of the environmental conditions. So I'd encourage you, if you are concerned about having resistance already in your flies, that this coming season when you're applying the products, that you are very vigilant. You really read the label, follow the instructions, do all that sort of stuff. Keep a close record. Make sure that your staff or yourself, whoever's doing it, does the job really well. And then later on in the season, when you first start getting Flystrike, record the dates and so forth. And if you're still concerned then, contact the manufacturer. They're always keen to hear this sort of thing, and you'll have all the information and be able to assure them that everything's been done correctly. So I do want to make it clear that even if resistance is present, particularly to dicyclonol, because it's such a long-acting product, it does not mean that you should just stop using those. Even with some reduced protection, it's still likely to be providing a longer protection period than many other chemical types. So instead, aim to use it far more wisely, as I've outlined earlier, and if possible, less often and in rotation with other chemical groups. Now, because your Flystrike pressure can differ every year, resistance can develop without it having been really obvious in the previous year. And of course, some sheep may have missed a treatment too. So you really do need to monitor regardless of whether a product has been applied. In high-risk times, step up your checking of your susceptible sheep in particular to each 2 days. And that's those ones maybe they're getting close to being crutched and you know they've got quite a lot of urine stain, or there's some young lambs or something, and you've got ongoing rain or high humidity. You know, up your checking at that point in time, and that checking, it does need close inspection in the paddock. Look, it's not just a drive past. So monitoring is important for slowing development of resistance. And the reason is that if those sheep have had a preventative treatment but do get struck, those flies, those maggots on them, could be resistant to that particular chemical that's been applied already. And on that basis, all struck sheep should be treated. How do you do that? Well, it's not just any treatment protocol. Your protocol should also minimise that build-up of resistant flies. So your aim is not just to stop the strike for the sake of the sheep, but to kill any maggots as well. So mechanical shearing's better than hand clipping if you can get them to the shed, and also it's going to be easier to collect up the maggots on a hard floor in the shed. But if you do need to hand clip a few in the paddock, why don't you have a little ground sheet and some plastic bags in your treatment kit as well. Now, ensure that you shear a decent band of wool from around the wound to, you know, you've got to find all those little maggot trails because you don't want to miss any of those maggots. And you need to use a registered dressing that provides a quick kill of any maggots remaining on the sheep. And I'll just point out that cyromazine or dicyclonol alone won't do that. They take a few days to kill the maggots, and that can be an animal welfare concern. So use a different chemical group to what's on the sheep, as I've mentioned before, just in case these maggots are resistant to the original product. And don't bother using a dressing with organophosphates. Unfortunately, diazinon, it's just not effective enough anymore. Now, those treated sheep will still attract flies, so keep them away from the main mob till they're healed up. And because these sheep are often repeat offenders and are likely to be genetically more susceptible, if possible, avoid keeping them for breeding. So here's your reminder that you can find plenty of information about flystrike management, prevention and treatment at flyboss.com.au. You can also keep up to date with parasite management by subscribing to the Paraboss News e-newsletter and by following Paraboss on Facebook. And I'd like to thank AWI and Sheep Connect for sponsoring this presentation. Thanks, Fiona.
Thanks, Deb. That was fantastic. We will move straight into question time. There are lots of wonderful questions coming through. It's not too late to give us your questions. So I'm going to transfer the reins over to Megan, who is our project manager, and she will chair question time for you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Deb, and thanks, Fiona, for handing over. I guess I'll preface our question session by saying there are a lot of questions that have come in while you've been talking, Deb. So there's lots of interest in all facets of the presentation. They started about 5 minutes in, well, probably not even 5 minutes in. So I guess the first one I'll start with, I'll try and group them together a little bit if I can. And we'll get through as many as we can with the time. Hopefully we'll get through them all. So the first one is just a little bit about moving from hair breeds across to merinos and then having sort of crossbreds, and what the different susceptibility might be in a, say, second cross shedding breed as opposed to a first or second cross traditional type lamb, prime lamb breed. In terms of
that's a pretty hard one. That's a pretty hard one for me, actually. I don't have a lot of experience with those sorts of things. All I can say is I think you need to have a look at what your genetics are, and you're going to be looking at whether or not they've got a fleece that is hard to wet, and when it does get wet, whether it's hard to dry, whether it's got a lot of yellowness in it, which is going to hold more moisture in there. So sorry, Megan, I don't think I can tell you particularly about those ones.
It was a pretty tough one, and I'll just preface that by saying, Frank, there's probably a whole day's worth of talking in that, but I guess I think you've hit the nail on the head there, Deb, talking about what the characteristics of the fleece are, and there's a lot of complexity in there, and I know in heavy fly pressure, it doesn't really matter what type of crossbred that you've got, then there's a fair bit of fleece rot type of susceptibility that floats through there. Now, I'll quickly touch the tail length is, and so that's sheep tail length, not chemical tail length. Took me a little while as I was looking through the questions, just to make sure that I had the right tail, that I was talking about the right tail. So in terms of sheep tail length, Emily's a bit keen to find out about how tail length predisposes a lamb to arthritis.
Righto, another hard question for me. Why does it occur? Part of it is that a longer tail still has enough musculature attached to it that enables a sheep to lift its tail out of the way of the feces coming out. So that's one of the things where I understand it works. After that, I'm actually not sure.
There's just in terms of the tail length topic, there's the recording from last week's webinar where we talked about tail length. So yeah, we're on a bit of a roll with tail length at the moment. So we're talking about lamb marking, so we can revert back to that. But again, shorter tails does predispose lambs to arthritis. So another pretty technical question. I'm not sure whether this is something that we can answer here now. It's just with regards to the effectiveness of freeze brand treatment in place of mulesing.
I can't talk about that, I'm sorry, don't know.
No worries. Now, I've got some really complicated questions about the chemical tail, Deb. So yeah, we're moving from the sheep's tail across to the chemical tail. Now, I'm going to start.
I'm not a research expert on this topic, so I'll do my best, but it might be something that we need to find. Any of these things that we can't answer on the spot, I'll see if we can find some answers for them.
Absolutely. Oh, thank you. That's great. So the first one, and there's a few here that I'll ask together. So why is it not recommended to use chemical groups in combination like drenches to avoid that sort of, drop off that we get?
Okay, so again, this is a lot of complexity to it, and I'm just going back to a conversation that I've had with one of our researchers, Jan Lawrenson, who says that with lice, with worms, we know all the situation, we know that combinations work, etc. With lice, the combinations are just being introduced now, and if we have a big problem with it, they're just lice. Flystrike, however, is considerably more serious, and the concern, it's not that a combination wouldn't be more effective. The concern is that if you have combinations and gain resistance to the combination, you start getting into a catastrophic failure type situation. So that's why rotation is being chosen as the preferred strategy for flystrike control rather than combination products. And that's probably all I can say on it. It's a pretty hairy topic.
It's a complicated topic, and yeah, we're very mindful of how technical some of these questions are. One of them, another one here on the chemical tail. Is it the tail that's driving resistance more than selecting for flies that survive the protection period? And how does selecting flies during the tail enable those survivors to survive a higher dose? Sorry, everyone, that's really complicated. Do you want me to ask that again, Deb?
Yeah, just hold on a minute and I'll just find one of these graphs with the tail in there. We'll use that one, yeah. So just go through it again in a portion. Just start with the first part of it.
Yep, so there's two parts to this. So does the tail drive resistance more than selecting for flies that survive the protection period?
I'm not seeing the difference there. So the tail is, sorry, the flies don't survive the protection period initially. That protection period is the protection period. When that chemical was first developed, all the flies, all the maggots died in that period of time. So it is once some survive that we're talking about a tail. Now, it might be that we've got some thought about the fact that this protection period becomes shorter. So the protection period is a number that's on a label. What happens on anyone's particular farm, what really happens is the protection period for their farm. So protection period will be whatever flies are dying. Once they start surviving a properly applied treatment, then we're into the tail, no matter whether that was whether that was back here or back there with the green line or back further. That's where the protection period on that particular farm ends. And it's the period after that that we call the tail. And during that time, resistant flies live, susceptible flies die. until the dose gets down, the concentration's down so low that it's not killing anything. So wherever the tail happens to be on that particular property, that time's an issue. Second part of the question?
So the second part is how does selecting flies during the tail enable those survivors to survive the higher dose? So I think that it's about the ones which survive then.
Yeah. Why if they live at a low dose, why if these ones that are living through this particular concentration but died earlier, why do they suddenly live at higher concentrations? Well, they don't. It's not the same flies. The ones that survive the tail but died earlier would have died at a higher concentration, are breeding more flies. And what they're doing is passing on those resistance genes. And when they pass it on with a susceptible fly, they probably end up with some flies that are only just the same resistance or even more or even susceptible. If they happen to breed with some other flies that are partially resistant, because this is based on the assumption that it is a multi-genic trait, so a number of genes, and therefore you can acquire more than one. And so sometimes the flies bred from two partially resistant flies can end up with more genes than their parents. And so that having extra genes allows them apparently to tolerate higher doses of chemicals. So it's not the same flies, it's their offspring that have more genes for resistance are then the ones that are able to tolerate higher concentrations. I hope I've made that clear enough.
Yeah. It's complex, isn't it, Deb? I guess just while we're talking about the tail of the chemical and how it reduces, and I think this one, it's all very much related. How do you know when the tail, when you've entered that tail period for your certain chemicals? And I know that this is very much probably a how long's a piece of string answer, but can you run through when that tail period might start? What factors influence when that tail period would start?
Pretty much the only thing that you can do is, number one, know what the up to protection period is on your label, and then you need to monitor them. The only thing that you're going to know is that you get struck sheep struck sooner than it says on the label. Remember, of course, that that protection period could be shorter because of how you've applied the chemical, or you could have had huge rains. I mean, look at the rains some of us had in January this year. That's not going to do any chemical any good, even though they're adhered to the wool pretty well, and they're just not water soluble like some of the old ones. You know, they still will degrade more or wash out a little bit with a lot of rain on them. So unfortunately, all you can do is monitor and see whether or not your protection period is shortening. And if you feel very confident that it's been applied well and that you haven't had particularly unusual weather conditions, then there's some assumption that possibly you have resistant flies. And unfortunately, you can't just go and get a test for it unless you're prepared to pay quite a bit of money. That's a very expensive test.
Is there likely to be, and I'm not sure whether you can answer this, Deb, is there likely to be a more commercial test, you know, in the future, or is that something that's going to be sort of maintained purely in a research and a, you know, an industry development type space?
New South Wales DPI has been conducting the research, and they have indicated the possibility that they could have a commercial test if there was sufficient demand to enable to keep it ticking over. But it was indicated to me that a test is in the order of a couple of $1,000, say about $3,000 to test all chemicals. And that's because it's not like you just send the maggots and they do some DNA test on it or they squirt a bit of chemical on it. They actually breed the flies, those flies from that one place, they breed them over 2 generations, so that's a fair bit of work. And then they have to put them, subject them to a whole variety of concentrations of chemicals. So it's actually a very large amount of work. So, you know, there is the possibility in the future, but I think considering the uptake of drench tests for sheep that might be $800 or $900, I think that ones for a couple of thousand for flies, there's not going to be a big uptake. And honestly, in a way, it doesn't. It's lovely to know, but it doesn't really matter, because once you know that you have resistant flies, what are you going to do about it? What you're going to do is these strategies that we've put forward for you. You're going to know that you have a lesser protection period. So putting all these other things into place is your only option anyway. And so if you start doing that now, before you even think you have it, or if you think you do have some, you're going to be on the right track anyway.
Thanks, Deb. Now, I've got a couple of comments here, and I'm conscious that we've just gone over 2 o'clock. I've got a couple of comments back to the sheep tail length question that was asked, and thank you to the few people that have added to that. So longer tails taking longer to heal and therefore increasing the risk of infection. Again, the higher surface area of an open wound. Shorter tail, broad wound, longer healing, increased chance of infection. Another one, so there's obviously some people here that know this, so I'm pretty sure that Liz, thank you, Liz, docking tails too short, increasing the incidence of bacterial arthritis. Recent work from South Australia showed an association between short tail docking and arthritis. Arthritis in lambs often begins with an infected skin wound, such as those caused by marking, mulesing or shearing. So I think that's Liz from the Paraboss team who's jumped on there. So thank you, Liz, for that. Now, I've got a really complicated question here, but it's again about what's driving resistance, and then we're not far from answering all of the questions. So we'll continue on with that one. And this one is about contact landing of flies on sheep during the protective period and whether that can contribute to resistance, i.e. fly lands on the sheep, gets chemical on its feet, flies off, cleans itself and gets a low dose of chemical. Is that something that's happening and contributing to that to the resistance space?
My understanding, which is limited on this matter, is that it's not, because most of these chemicals act in a fairly specific way. They act on the nervous system of the maggots, or they act on the development of the exoskeleton in the maggots. One of them, and I just can't remember which one, is does affect the adult fly, but most of our preventatives are about the maggots, and so it's my understanding that this doesn't affect it, but I could be wrong.
Thanks, Deb. Gosh, we've had some pretty hectic questions there for, probably for some entomologists to answer. So I think you're doing a pretty solid job. Patrick's just said that the IGRs are only larvicidal, so he's popped a comment in there. One further question.
Megan, what I'll do is we'll get some answers to all these questions, some more details, and we'll pop them into one of our next newsletters.
That's a great idea. We could probably also put put it together as just a one-page PDF to put with the recording on our website as well, so that people can go back to that.
Sure.
And the other thing that we can do is we can email everybody direct from today's webinar. So there's some pretty wild questions. Well, not wild, but difficult questions to answer. One person here's asked, can we actually trust? Hang on, my little thing, can't click on it. Not sure why it's gone. Oh, can we trust the length of protection quoted on the label of fly products, or are we likely to see the tail starting to occur within the quoted period? Yeah, that's a difficult one to answer, no doubt.
Can we trust them? Of course we can. These companies, they have it bloody tough with the APVMA in Australia. There's very exacting standards. So they've done this research. They can only do the research on what's happening at that time with the fly population that's there at the time. So you can trust the claim of protection period on the labels when those products come out. And that's why they say up to, because things change over time. And as resistance develops, then of course it will decrease. We see that with chemicals for decades. It happens, and not just in our industry, and with worms as well. So yes, you can trust that they are right when they're first put out, but some properties will still be using those chemicals with the full protection period for years and years to come, and others won't be, and it'll mostly be because of the practices they've done on their own property that ruin it.
Yeah, it's about how we're applying it, what the conditions are, and like you say, adherence to the labels, and that's just such an important part of managing these products to keep them working. It's a bit like the drench story, isn't it, Deb, about making sure that that you've got what the weight of your animals are, and adhering to the label and not underdosing and things like that. So
sure.
There's quite a lot to it. Just wanted to so Patrick, again, he's just given you a well done, Deb. Great talk, tough questions. So pat yourself on the back for that, Deb. There've been a lot of tough questions and you've handled them very well. There's some here that are very much at some entomological guru type level. So we'll do our best to get the answers to those, and we'll put them together in conjunction with Deb and the team at Paraboss. So Fiona, I might hand back to you now for the wrap up.
Thanks, Megan. Thanks, Deb. I agree. I think that was the most challenging question time I've ever seen since our webinar series have begun, Deb. So well done. Glad I wasn't on the receiving end of them. So just to wrap up, everybody, thanks, Deb, for today's presentation. I've certainly enjoyed it. It was really wonderful. And thanks to all of our attendees for your participation and for all the audience engagement. I know the questions were tough for Deb, but we really love getting the engagement going. So thanks everyone for participating so well in question time. And don't forget, the survey will be coming out this afternoon. You have a chance here to tell me if there's future topics you'd like to hear about, and give us feedback. We love feedback. We're constantly trying to improve here to deliver the best information to you possible. So thanks in advance for filling it in, and the recording will be emailed to you this afternoon, and will also be available on our website. So just before I go, what's happening next week? Well, next week's another exciting week. We have our second Q&A session. So I'm pleased to invite you to register for our Sheep Live Q&A on all things worm control next Wednesday, the 9th of September at 10 AM. And Dr. Matt Playford will be joining us as our panelist to answer all your questions. Just a reminder that this is a live session, and no recording will be made available later. We also have increased the number of registrations we can take for this session due to the popularity of our first Q&A session. But a reminder, if you can't attend, can you please deregister so that people on the wait list won't miss out on the session? And next our webinar, which is on Thursday, the 10th of September at 1 p.m. So as Deb put really simply in her presentation, there's two types of resistance. The first type is flies that are resistant to chemicals, which Deb has certainly covered for you all today. So I'm joined next week by Jeff Linden from AWI, and we're going to look at the second type of resistance, which is sheep being resistant to flies. So we're going to look at breeding for improved fly resistance in our sheep flock. So once again, thank you everybody for joining the webinar today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your week. Bye for now.
Bye everyone. Thanks,
Thank you.
Deb. Thanks, Fiona.
Bye-bye.
Bye, thanks.